Hello, this is Mark Schocker with my final presentation on the powers and values of identity. So when I mean identity, I mean the words we use to describe ourselves. It's defined as the qualities, beliefs, personality, looks, and/or expressions that make up a group or a person. Basically, how we describe ourselves. And in this presentation, I'm going to kind of go over the different meanings behind the words that we use, the history of the English language, how some words have changes and different meanings throughout history, and how some words already have predetermined meanings to it. So the history of the English language is kind of long. I'm going to try to keep it as short as I can, just for presentation's sake. It's basically a West Germanic language that was derived from the Anglo-Frisian dialects and the Anglo-Saxon settlers. And that's kind of the Indo-European kind of area. For the Old English language, it was derived a lot from the Anglo-Saxon people. They picked a lot from ancient German and ancient French languages. They had their own runic scripts that was called Furthok. And it was eventually replaced by the Latin alphabet that was introduced by the Irish missionaries and brought about the ideas of Christianity, and different words and languages got brought in with that kind of association. For the Middle English language, this was probably one of the biggest shifts for the English language. This is through the Anglo-Norman and more of the French settlers as well. There were a lot of conquests and kind of battles and territory takeovers that happened in this time. And so with this big change brought about a huge jump in vocabulary and pronunciations. Old English was more of like an inflected language. It was very guttural, and it was not as extensive as some of the Middle English languages that came with it. Old English was more of like, instead of saying, I'm hungry, so I'm going to go eat food, it would say, hunger. It was very punctual, it was very short and to the point. Middle English brought vocabulary, it brought words and pronunciations. For the early modern English, think of kind of the Shakespearean area. There was a lot of sound changes that went underneath with this. A lot of spelling conventions as well, capitalizations in words. The governments and religion kind of ideas really influenced this a lot, especially with religion. And a lot of ideas came around for just different kinds of accents and dialects throughout different regions throughout this kind of area of that time. And increased rates of literacy and easier ways to travel kind of facilitated different ways of people going out to experience different languages, which is also what brought along different dialects and accents. And this kind of brought in a more borrowing of some of the Latin and Greek words of this time. This is kind of the Renaissance area in the 17th century. And so in late modern, really the main difference is a huge increase in vocabulary. Some of the words that we used changed as well, but it was basically the English language in this time was kind of moving into more the Industrial Revolution, the technology kind of area. And a lot of those industries brought around big changes to the language. All throughout history, we've seen a lot of it was usually government and religion and some settlers that borrowed a lot of words. But as time went on, it was more industrial. There were technologies, there were markets that drove different demands for different uses of languages. And we'll go into that here in a second. And it's interesting to see this because it brings up the question, why does language change? Why does it evolve and develop different language forms and dialects? And that's mainly due to kind of 5 different ways that I've pulled from 5 different sources. Well, I read a whole bunch of sources. I just kind of picked the 5 ones that kind of summarize things in the best ways. So what I mean is the economy and efficiency was you're trying to be short, you're trying to be efficient, you try to get your point across the best way that you can. With that means you have to use the right words to get your point across. You have to make sure the other person's understanding you, so you have to use better, smarter words to be more efficient in how you speak. Analogies and alternate uses. This kind of came around from a lot more of the traveling and a lot more of needing different ways to describe different things, like synonyms for different words. This kind of came from like different roots and forms of different words and became into different words themselves. Imperfect learning was just someone kind of experiencing a language, forming it imperfectly, and turning it into new dialects and different ways of speaking, like how we say y'all instead of you all. That was kind of a cultural and regional change to words that we used that gave new definitions and ways of people to address others. It wasn't an imperfect way of doing it, but it was a way of just changing a language culturally. That kind of goes hand in hand with language contact and interactions, and social status and prestige. These two last ones are probably the two biggest ones. Language contact being you're experiencing a lot more people geographically and regionally, you're interacting with a lot of people, you're going to experience different languages, and you're going to experience different ways for people to speak and get in contact with you. If you want to talk to people, and if you're trying to sell somebody something, if you're a merchant, you have to be able to speak that language. You have to be able to get your point across to be able to talk to them. And of course, it has social statuses and prestige tied in with a lot of different languages in general. Specifically for this class, we've talked a lot about the hegemony of English and the prestige that comes with English as well. But that was a big demand and a big driver for shifts in the English language and language as a whole. If people considered English to be the hot quote-unquote language, they would want to switch to that to be able to seem more higher up in social status. We see a lot of these phrases and languages kind of compete with each other. Here we have the idea of code switching, which is where two or more languages kind of get combined together in the same kind of region to essentially form different, like a combination of German and English. Nowadays, it's a modern language. It's called Danglish. It's used a lot more in the Amish community, but this is seen as a very old traditional way of communicating. They would combine two different languages so that two different cultures can kind of get by at least understanding half of one language and maybe not half of the other. But there would eventually be kind of different communities that would decide what were minority languages, what were dominant languages. Here on the bottom, underneath my little smiley face, I chose to pair different words and translations for the word of happiness, just for fun, to see how different languages kind of have different cultural ideas with a lot of the words that they use. So here in German, the German word for happy is glücklich, which is more of a personal happiness that is often associated with luck. In French, we have heureux, which is kind of being pleased or satisfied with yourself, and also being having a sense of being joyful or being lucky. These two are very similar. They're more possessive towards the self. In Latin here we have felix, which is kind of being happy or fortunate, similar to the other two. Latin is a bit of a confusing language to learn, but basically a lot of the Latin adjectives kind of pair differently to different nouns, so there can be different kind of meanings and associations with the different nouns it's paired with. And then Welsh here at the bottom, definitely the harder of the four. We have hapes ruid, I think. It's more of like an emotional or a mental state of being that kind of characterizes how you feel right now, that you're feeling pleasant emotions. This is kind of very common in a lot of Welsh adjectives. They really talk about your emotional state of being in your moments at a particular moment in time. But I thought this would be a really good segue into how different words can kind of grow from different meanings in different contexts of different cultures. With the German and French kind of being more focused on the self and being I'm happy right now, and then the Welsh language really focusing on yourself spiritually, yourself being in this moment of time is very important to the Welsh cultures. And so from this, using each language as a different value, we're going to talk a little bit more the technological, I guess, process of words. The communication process can be a huge role in defining words. Basically, language is multi-dimensional, meaning if I say orange, two people can think of two different things, one of the color orange and one of the fruit orange. Knowing the word kind of has the fullest range of meanings possible. The introduction of native speaker norms of a country can inflect different meanings. Kind of just basically meaning the small differences in the wordings that you use to produce something can mean different things. Like think of if I say I am willful to do something or I am willing to do something, the two different underlying phrases that I use to say those things can have two different meanings. One has a little bit more contempt to it and one is a little bit more polite. But it's basically, I wanted to showcase how there is a huge study on expanding the communication process and really going in the depth of the mental lexicon of talking about language as more of like a thing in itself and not even something that we can define. Language is, I know it's getting super meta, but it's like using language to describe language isn't even a language. There's a lot of really interesting readings about how using spoken words that involve like phonological structures and the syntax and arrangements of how you say words can have the super utmost importance of how you phrase something. It's the degree of your utterances, meaning that's kind of what I said earlier about being willful or being willing. How you say something can have different phrases and different meanings. Think of like sarcasm or humor as a way of like creating a facade for language to kind of create an ulterior meaning based off of what you're trying to impose on somebody else. And since we now have gone over the physical process of language and word associations, we can see how it kind of has been going into trying to affect us. The communication process, of course, affects the human psyche a whole lot, but this is more like the modern environments of pairing the values and identities in today's world. Transformative power of language is nowadays the word and definition for language is changing even in and of itself. More ways are being used to describe people and a lot of their values. I found this really interesting idea of transformative pedagogy in schools and higher education, which is basically educations that recognize inequities and endeavors in English and the English language, similar to what our class has basically been doing this whole time, is creating an awareness and realization that languages really do have power and the languages we use really matter to each other. And for the influence of other people's words that they have on you, think of like a phrase or something that you've listened to and you can really resonate with. Word choice has a huge impact on how you say things and how you describe yourself and others. A common example now is media, and how the language that media uses to talk about like a world events or just an article that they've written can influence their audience and skew them one way versus another, just simply based off of how they phrase their argument. And it's the idea of how language, the word choice that we use is of the utmost importance because it can really impact somebody. There's a really interesting article that talks about how really finding somebody's identity, air quotes, is really just more of a way to even look at how they can think politically and how they can form different claims of how their lives have been constructed up to this point. Basically going into the idea of how an identity is like a socially constructed idea and not even something you're kind of born with. This goes right into the ideas of gender expression and gender identity. I really don't mean to pick a side or make someone uncomfortable with this, only because it's a very hot topic right now and I'm not trying to stir up anything, but it's really important to look at how the ideas of identity has been transformed by these phrases of gender expression and gender identity, and how it's the transformation of the language that we are now using to describe ourselves. And this is a super interesting idea that really only started back in the 1990s. So basically, the idea of identity is really more like the definition of what identity even is. It's hard to describe and it's hard to put words into because it's fluid and it's ever changing. But basically the values that we put into it are our own values. It is subjective to yourself, and we have the power to change our language. This has been my presentation. This is Mark Shocker once again. Here's all of my sources, and thank you.